Welcome to our final episode of Disciple Dojo for the year. Guys, 2022 has been a tough year, but it's been an amazing year because thanks to you, we hit our goal of over 5,000 subscribers. That means there are over 5,000 people regularly watching Disciple Dojo content. So appreciative. Thank you, all of you who have supported this channel. Thank you especially to those who have hit the notifications button, who have left comments, who have just interacted in ways that lets YouTube's algorithms know we want to see more of this content. We couldn't do any of this without you guys. For this last episode of the year, I wanted to make it special, and so this is our first two-part interview. A lot of people are intimidated by or confused by or just don't even know anything about biblical text criticism. And when they do, most discussions about text criticism focus on the New Testament, the Greek New Testament. So what I wanted to do in this final episode of 2022 is bring in a bona fide Hebrew Bible text critical expert. Someone who knows the ins and outs of how we got our Hebrew Bible, or as Christians may be familiar with it, Old Testament. Because when it comes to the history of the Hebrew Bible, how we got from the ancient texts of the Torah, or the prophets, or the writings, the scrolls that were handed down and passed on for generations and generations, copied, recopied. How did we get from this to a critical edition of the Hebrew text, reconstructed by scholars, and then in turn used as the basis for translations of our English Bibles that we read from, teach from, preach from, and study today. So getting from this to this was not a straightforward process. It can get kind of messy, but I think it's a fascinating process. And the more I learn about it, the more confidence I have in the Bible that we have today. So for this discussion, I've invited my friend, Dr. Christopher Dost, multiple degrees from Jewish Theological Seminary, has written about Hebrew text criticism, has worked on the Biblica Hebraica Quinta, which is the in-progress updated critical edition of the Hebrew Bible, and who has a channel here on YouTube called Biblical Languages and Literature. We had a great discussion. It was a long discussion. I mean, we talked for, probably 4 hours, and so cutting it down to even a two-part video was a bit of a challenge, but once you get two Bible nerds talking, kind of hard to get us to stop. We discussed everything from Old Testament text criticism to crazy viral videos people share about secret meanings in the words in Hebrew, to how can we even trust that what we're reading is accurate when we open our Bibles. We looked at some examples where text criticism actually makes a difference in how you translate the text, and we talked honestly and openly about some places where scholars have different opinions, and where some people get a little uncomfortable with some of the ambiguities that studying biblical language and literature can bring to the surface. So I hope you enjoy this discussion with Dr. Chris Dost. As always, if you appreciate this ministry, the best way that you can support us is by becoming a monthly Dojo donor. This ministry is entirely donor funded. We're a nonprofit. We rely on people not just subscribing and liking and sharing and clicking the notifications bell and all those things that help us here on YouTube, but honestly, people just coming alongside financially and supporting Disciple Dojo as a worldwide discipleship teaching ministry. So if you appreciate this interview, we'd love for you to partner with us and help us, especially if you're looking for an opportunity for year-end giving. We would greatly appreciate your support. Okay, enjoy this discussion. I came across your work on your video channel on YouTube with the language stuff that you do, and the text critical stuff is what really interested me, being a Bible nerd. Okay. And so I picked up Jesus's Bible. I have the Kindle edition. And so folks, I highly recommend this work. It's very readable. It's an introduction. It's basically, the subtitle is A Concise History of the Hebrew Scriptures. It's a great introduction to the Hebrew text criticism. So I'm really excited that you joined us today. When I was in seminary, we learned text criticism only through New Testament. So the only Old Testament text criticism we ever did was if we took an Old Testament exegesis, like a higher level Old Testament class, whereas everyone had to take New Testament text criticism. And is that Was that your experience, or do you think that's fairly common?
We had to do, as at least in my degree programs at Alliance Theological Seminary, which is the first graduate degree where I did my first graduate degree. I came in actually as a New Testament student. I had a
Okay.
passion for Greek. And so I think the first course that I took at the seminary was Greek exegesis with Bill Crockett.
Hmm.
And we had to do a fair amount of textual criticism in that class. And I think it was partly because Bill Crockett was a student of Bruce Metzger's
Oh, okay.
when Bruce Metzger was, alive, still teaching. And so that really just whetted my appetite for text criticism. And then when I switched over to the Hebrew Bible Old Testament track, we had some text criticism, but, I don't know, maybe 2 weeks of it,
Mm-hmm.
2 lectures.
Okay.
And that was the extent of it. So, no, I was by no means an expert coming out of seminary.
I mean, obviously, New Testament text criticism as a field has had more, I feel like it's been more refined. There are 20 something critical editions. I mean, more probably, but at least of the Nestle Allen. Whereas in Hebrew Bible, there haven't been as many critical editions, obviously because of the length of the work itself, and also because of there are just so many more Greek manuscripts than Hebrew texts.
Yeah, and it's not so much about the number of manuscripts as it is about the inherent problems
Mm-hmm.
in the history of the transmission of the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. And just for the listeners, I tend to use the term Hebrew Bible. So,
Yes.
for the Christian listeners out there, Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, we're talking about the same thing.
Right.
But the transmission of the Hebrew Bible is a very different process from how the New Testament became a book or an anthology.
Mm-hmm.
And a big part of the reason for the discrepancy is that the New Testament was written in a very short amount of time. We're talking about under a century,
Mm-hmm.
whereas the Hebrew Bible, at least for the writing of it, period of about 1,000 years.
Mm-hmm.
That's a big difference from under 100 years.
Yeah.
And so the problems that Hebrew Bible text critics face are there's a lot of similarities, but a lot of differences and a lot more complexities from what New Testament text critics face.
They're two very, I don't want to say they're entirely different because theoretically they're doing the same thing, but like you're talking about, because of the actual factors of the transmission of the text and even down to orthography and how texts were written in New Testament times and New Testament being disseminated so quickly and so widely, right, versus the very, at least in theory, controlled transmission of the Hebrew text. New Testament is almost like the Wild West in terms of manuscripts that were circulating and being put out there quickly and in different languages, and the Hebrew Bible very, very much not that. I'm super happy that you're our final guest of 2022. And this is the Christmas present to Dojo viewers, is we're going to get real nerdy into biblical studies and text criticism. I want to ask you some beginning questions because, some people may not know your primarily, at least your YouTube channel primarily is linguistic. It's interpretive and text critical, but the languages are what seem to dominate your playlist. How many languages do you read, speak, communicate in, however you wanted to put it?
When you do a degree in Hebrew Bible, you have to have some familiarity with the family of Semitic languages, and then all of the languages into which the Bible was translated in ancient times. And so, the stuff that I'm admittedly weak in are things like Phoenician and Moabite and that sort of thing. That's not my area of specialty, but as part of a doctoral program, you have to be able to read inscriptions and certain texts from the world of the Bible. Ugaritic is another important one, which is a second millennium. We'll put Canaanite in air quotes. It's not officially a Canaanite language, but it's very, very similar to Hebrew. and very relevant. You have to know some Akkadian, which is, was the main language of, Babylon and Assyria for quite some time. So most ancient Mesopotamian texts would be written in Akkadian. I'm much stronger in Aramaic and Hebrew. I've also done a fair amount with Arabic and Biblical Greek. So depending on how you number those, about 7 on different levels. But then, I've had to do some French and German, but if people ask me if I speak French and German, the answer is no. You have to take a reading proficiency exam so that you can read some journals, and that's the extent of it. But in terms of modern languages, modern Hebrew, Palestinian Arabic, and then, Spanish. And, again, my proficiency level with those, when you deal with so many languages, it's kind of like the stock market, right. Up and down and up and down. But these days, it's more Arabic and Spanish that I'm dealing with.
I tell people ask, like, oh, you read Hebrew or you read Greek. I'm like, no, I decipher Hebrew and Greek. Like it takes me a minute. I can't sit and sight read, and, certainly couldn't ever speak in any of the biblical languages, but it's real. Languages did they just come easy to you, or did you have to really, really work? Are you one of those who naturally picks up on linguistic concepts, or are they difficult for you to wrap your mind around?
Well, at least what I found is that once you've learned one foreign language and you get on to your second, your mind develops paradigms, and it's much easier to learn a second and third and fourth language because languages are not really all that different at their core. They may sound different, they may look different in writing, but most of the languages that we're talking about here, when you look at the core makeup of them, there's just not a heck of a lot of difference. So, one of my seminary professors said about Hebrew one time, he said, sometimes things that look the same are really very different, and things that look different are actually very much the same. And so that's what I've found is that, a lot of these languages that look so different and sound so different, they're really very similar when you get right down to it. Some more than others, but you get the idea. Right.
To me, the biggest difference that I've noticed, or at least the biggest struggle for me as a not linguistically inclined person, being out of seminary 20 years now, trying to keep my languages proficient on my own, the biggest difference is vocabulary, English cognates. So like Greek vocabulary is pretty easy because a third of our language comes from Greek. Hebrew vocabulary is ruthlessly hard for me because so every verb sounds the same to me in Hebrew. And I mean, they look like, that's what I'm saying. When I was in Israel, hearing Hebrew, I had no idea what you're saying because of so many sounds being linguistically similar. But if it was written out, oh, okay, I know what that word means. Okay, I can make my way through there. So what are some tips for somebody trying to, is it just you got to immerse and that's the only way? Or
what I've found, and a number of my former students who've gone on for doctoral work or advanced work in Hebrew Bible have found that when you study biblical Hebrew, for instance, it is a dead language. And the Hebrew of the Hebrew scriptures or the Old Testament isn't even really exactly the same language throughout. I mean, it's not even taught in first year and second year Hebrew usually, that there is Israelian Hebrew, the Hebrew of the Northern Kingdom, and there is Southern Hebrew or Judean Hebrew in the Bible. And usually what we're taught is Judean Hebrew because that's the predominant one. And so there are differences. You also have different registers. So reading Deuteronomy, for instance, is far easier than reading, say, Proverbs or the Psalms or something like that. What I find, and I think anybody who's honest with you, even most of the most advanced scholars, are going to say that there are certain parts of the Bible that they can read very easily and other parts where they have to sit down and, sometimes look at commentaries, dictionaries, because, if it's passage you haven't looked at in a few years and there's one word that in its context doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense, and you haven't seen it for so long, well, it's natural that you're going to forget it. So sometimes some helps are necessary.
That was Richard Middleton was my last guest on our last episode, and we went did a deep dive on Psalm 77 that he had presented at SBL, and he made the exact same point. He said, you after you've taken Hebrew in seminary, Hebrew prose, basic Hebrew prose, but you do not know Hebrew poetry. So that's something I think that's something I think viewers it's important to realize, because in writing about Old Testament, people sometimes oversimplify. And for a popular audience, of course, you have to do a degree of oversimplification. But then that trickles into apologetics or popular preaching. And then that trickles into your everyday people. And so when somebody does start to explore the complexities of text criticism, which we'll talk about, or of even the Hebrew language or the Greek language of Scripture, they start to get nervous because it seems to undermine the certainty that they've always heard preached or read in apologetics books. And so I appreciated that about your book, about Jesus's Bible. Yeah. That makes people uncomfortable. What do you say to somebody who says, Dr. Dost, this is starting to make me uncomfortable?
What I, as a pastor, because I'm also a pastor too, but I try to be, as best I can, to just be honest when I'm preaching about what I know to be true as a scholar, or what I'm, at least to the best of my ability, or the best I can say, certain about as a scholar. And it's this, that it's usually the people who fear these kinds of discussions are people who have a strong faith in God. And what I like to point out to them is that, in Jesus's day, and this comes up in different ways in my book, Jesus's Bible, there was no one version of the Hebrew Bible. It simply didn't exist. The text of Jeremiah, for instance, if you look in the Dead Sea Scrolls, you've got a short version and a long version, and they're significantly different. The fact that the writers of the New Testament often quote from the Septuagint, or the Greek Old Testament, that the Greek is a translation that has all sorts of corruptions in it. And yet, what we find, for those of us who believe that God is in the business of transforming people's lives and, transforming the world, is that he's always been in the business of transforming the world and transforming people's lives, oftentimes through the reading of biblical manuscripts or biblical translations that were faulty. And it's one of those things that, it is unsettling, because many people feel, and I heard this in Bible college, that once you start asking these questions, that theologically you're on a slippery slope towards atheism. There's no doubt about it that there are plenty of people whose faith has altered significantly. And there's just no doubt about that. But, I am, while certain views I have changed, I still find myself personally very much in the evangelical Christian community as I was before I went to seminary. It's just that I feel that I'm able to articulate some of those mysteries, particularly about how the Bible became a book and that sort of thing. But it hasn't undermined my faith in any way. It's just given me clarity and some new perspectives that might not be as popular in some circles, but I still find my home within the evangelical church. So it doesn't need to be something to be feared.
I think you're absolutely right. For me, learning text criticism and really getting into things, and the two biggest things for me in seminary takeaways were learning text criticism, just understanding that concept, how we got our Bibles, why we can why we can trust them, and also the ambiguity inherent in, particularly in Hebrew, but also in Greek, there's just an ambiguity of language that it allowed me now when I come to certain issues where Christians kind of get all up in arms about or want to debate endlessly. Now, when I come to some of them, I think my approach is usually like, yeah, there's good arguments for this. There's good arguments for this. I think there's ambiguity, and I think God's okay with that ambiguity. But if somebody, especially coming from a very strong, even fundamentalist background, that starts to get unnerving to a lot of people. And I just want to encourage viewers, you have Bruce Metzger and Bart Ehrman, right? And Bart Ehrman has well-known slide into agnosticism, and I think that's still where he ends up today. Bruce Metzger was, died a ordained churchman and from everybody that I know who's ever met him account, a godly, passionate follower of Jesus. And so people can look at the same thing and come to different conclusions. So you don't have to fear, oh, I'm going to end up like this person. Oh, I'm going to end up like this person.
And, Bart Ehrman, it's interesting that you mention him, I think it was in his book. Was it Jesus Interrupted? I
haven't read Jesus Interrupted, but I know that.
Okay. Book. I want to say that it was in that book that he talks about his journey in the introduction or chapter 1 or whatever. Mm-hmm. And he discusses some of these problems, and sometimes his conclusions about them are a little overblown. But but even if you were to take that at face value, his conclusions about some of these troubling issues, he says it wasn't, if I remember correctly, it wasn't those issues that led him into agnosticism. It was an entirely different theological issue, and it had to do with the problem of suffering. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's also worth noting. When people's theological views change drastically on a macro level, it's not always one simple cause or one simple factor. There's usually a complexity there.
That's a great point. Yeah. I mean, that's a good pastoral, being a pastor, from experience, when people are struggling with one issue, then that shapes how they view other issues. And so if somebody's struggling with God and theodicy or the death of a loved one or seeing some tragedy play on TV and wonder how can God do that, that's going to then shade the amount of trust that they're willing to give the text. So I know that you taught at Bethlehem Bible College at some point.
Yeah, I taught a modern Hebrew class for internationals online there. So
okay.
I haven't talked with them in a few months, but Bethlehem Bible College has had, I think this developed during COVID, an online initiative to bring, their theological educational product to the English-speaking world. And so they had asked me to teach a course in modern Hebrew, and we had a great time with it. Mm-hmm.
How did you get connected? How did that come about, or who were your connections there? Or
Yusuf Al-Khoury, who is a professor at Bethlehem Bible College now, mm-hmm. was a student at Alliance Theological Seminary, where I taught, first part-time in 2006 until I think I was there to like 2019. And so he was a student there. And, toward the end of his time there, he became a friend. And then I went to the Christ at the Checkpoint conference. I want to say that was 2018. And so I got to spend a good deal of time with Yusuf there and was introduced to many of the people from BBC, and just developed some friendships there as a result. So, yeah.
That's awesome. I took a group back to 2018. I went for the first time to Christ at Checkpoint in 2014. First time I'd ever been to the Holy Land. And that was actually where I feel like God put the vision for my refugee jitsu outreach, was when I was walking through the Ida refugee camp right in Bethlehem. But over the years, I stayed in touch with Jack and Munther and Sammy and some of the people there. And then in 2018, I took a small group, I think there were about 6 of us, and I took them to the conference and then to visit friends in Israel and see the Holy Land. And Yusuf was one of the people that I got to connect
Oh,
with.
so you know Yusuf. All right, wonderful. Yeah.
He's a great guy. I think I told him his job is to find me a Palestinian wife so that next time I come, I can, not be a single guy anymore, because bachelor life's getting old. So I don't know if he's really on that or not, but Yusuf, if you catch this, come on, man, get on it, because
if I talk to him, I'll encourage him. Yeah,
it would be. I wouldn't mind if I had to move from Charlotte. Bethlehem, I think, might be somewhere I could see ending up. But no, in all seriousness, viewers of Disciple Dojo have heard me mention Bethlehem Bible College before, but I really have a very tremendous amount of respect for what they're doing, how they're doing it, just being a light in Bethlehem, and the heart for bringing people together, even people that don't like each other or don't agree with each other.
Right.
As they invited my friend, Dr. Michael Brown, to come and speak, whose message was not by any means popular at that conference.
Right.
And he and I have debated before, and so I knew going in that was going to be interesting. But anybody that does that, especially in the midst of living in modern day West Bank, just has tremendous respect. What was how did you live in Israel? Did you spend time in the West Bank? Have you gone, or what's your experience been in the Holy Land?
Last time I was there, I've been there 3 times. The last time I was there for about a month. Mm-hmm. And I think the first part was for the conference, and then I stayed on for a while, and then my father came, and I think we spent another 2 weeks or so, both in the West Bank and in Israel, mm-hmm. Doing, some tourism. But the tourism is, it's exciting to go see those places, but these days I'm more interested in the people who actually live there now, the mm-hmm. people who are still living and breathing.
The living souls.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And but it was important for me to go there to the conference in 2018 because, I have 3 degrees from Jewish Theological Seminary. So I did the Master of Arts, the MPhil, and then the PhD there. And it was very important to me to understand whether the conference was anti-Semitic or not. Because there were people, certain Jewish friends who were under that impression. There were certainly people at Alliance Theological Seminary, not all of them, but, some of them who thought that. And I figure I really need to go to see this for myself. And I don't see anything they're doing as anti-Semitic in any way, shape, or form. My experience with it, and you might know better than I do, but knowing Jack Serra, the president of BBC, some of the professors there, I've even become friends with some of the staff. The Christ at the Checkpoint initiative is an honest, open-hearted, I would say almost first effort at trying to create a healthy discussion that takes seriously both the academic study of the Bible. You look at, I had Johanna Catanaccio, who's a president, I think he's the professor there, but he's been connected with Nazareth Evangelical College. You look at his work, he's a serious student of the scriptures, but he's also a churchman too. Mm-hmm. The conclusion that I came to is that they are doing a fantastic job. Now, you can look at any organization or any individual and, criticize them for this or that or the other thing. People do that with me all the time. And I take it for granted, even just with this podcast, that there'll be listeners who might hear something that I say and will vehemently disagree with it. And from my perspective, that's okay.
Right.
Because even if it turns out that I'm wrong, hopefully the fact that we're having an honest discussion about, some sensitive matters will help other people to clarify their position. In 2018, there were things that I thought, okay, next time they do this, I'd like to see them do that maybe. Right. But in terms of major criticisms or anti-Semitism or anything like that, I saw absolutely no evidence of that. And, knowing many of the people who put that conference together, I know for a fact that that's not who they are.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that any conference that brings together a wide array of voices, like you said, you're going to have people who they don't even people on the same side of an issue don't agree
Right.
on a lot of stuff. I mean, that's just the nature of any large group of people. And so people have mentioned before. I mean, when I got back in 2014 is when I debated Michael Brown on the whole Israeli-Palestinian, where should Christians stand? Should we stand with anybody?
Right.
And we had a good discussion at Gordon Conwell on that issue, and it was people can check it out online. I'll put a link in the video below. But I've realized it's the same with, when I talk with friends who go to like pro Zionism conferences, pro Stand with Israel conferences, that kind of stuff. When I talk to them, I'm like, you have beliefs that many people would look at and go, that's anti-Arab, that's
Right.
anti-Palestinian, that's very, but they would say, no, but that's not my heart. I'm not trying to do that. I'm trying to, because I love this, I'm trying to lift it up. So there's a lot of those type of discussions need to be had of like, okay, I hear in your heart. I'm hearing where you're coming from. Are you
Right.
hearing
Yeah, I
mine?
mean, even Michael Brown, I was in a group that he did, breakout session, I think, at the 2018 conference. Now, he and I, in terms of academic training, he went to NYU, did his doctorate there,
Mm-hmm.
and essentially a Jewish school, or a heavily Jewish school, which follows, and teaches historical critical principles, just like I studied at JTS. I have a lot of respect for him. He and I disagree on some really fundamental issues,
Mm-hmm.
and yet we have the same training. And so it's, what I took away from that, and, certainly other experiences, that even when people go through the same type of training, it doesn't guarantee that their views are going to come out the same.
That's a great
And,
point. Yep.
instead of, castigating one another, when you see that the person's heart is in the right place, and even though I disagree with him on, as I said, some very significant things, um, he's a good guy.
Mm-hmm.
And I can admit that, hey, maybe I'll see one day that I'm the one who's wrong about this. But yeah, just because someone disagrees
Mm-hmm.
doesn't mean we should shun them or, cast them off. That's the culture of our world today,
Right.
that polarizing culture. And that's not how we come to the truth. In fact, one of the things you find in the work of Walter Brueggemann, for instance, to do a little Old Testament theology for a minute,
Mm-hmm.
is that when one approaches just the Hebrew scriptures, for instance, and lets every book have its own voice, that we look at the Hebrew scriptures not as a book, but as an anthology, right?
Mm-hmm.
And let every book have its own voice, what we find is that sometimes those books are in tension with one another.
Mm-hmm.
And a great example is that I think is often missed is when you look at the book of Job, for instance. Why is it that the friends are, essentially condemned by God? And if you actually look at what they're saying, the problem that God has with them is that they were throwing in Job's face the wisdom, the type of wisdom that you find in the book of Proverbs.
Mm-hmm.
And when, once one comes to that realization that, wait a second, these guys were essentially quoting scripture back to Job, and God says, you guys were wrong about that. The theological implications of that are very substantial. But the takeaway for the purpose of this conversation is that even in the scriptures, you can find that even books, for various reasons, are in tension with one another,
Mm-hmm.
and God wanted it that way. I often would tell my students in seminary when they had a problem with this or this sort of thing made them feel uncomfortable, I said, look, guys, just think about the fact for a minute that God did not give believers a systematic theology.
Exactly.
He gave them a Bible, which is an anthology.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, the way evangelicals tend to look at the Bible is as if it's a systematic theology. It's not, but we
Right.
tend to treat it that way.
Right.
And that's really where the problem is.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. In the review, I did a review of the Systematic Theology Study Bible and used that to touch on this issue. What is systematic theology, and where I personally see its benefits, but also extreme limitations. And the
Right.
biggest one being, like you just said, it's not what God gave us. He didn't give us a set of timeless principles. He didn't give us axioms and eight noble truths. And any, he didn't give us these things that other religions and other philosophies kind of build themselves around or pride themselves on. He gave us a really fascinating, wonderful, confusing, messy story in a library form. And that in and of itself, I think once people grasp that, it makes a difference in their theology and their willingness to enter into dialogue with other people and to be made uncomfortable.
Yeah, and Christians can learn, really take the cue from Judaism in that, rabbinic Judaism, the Talmud is a multi-volume, let's just call it, for simplicity's sake, a multi-volume set of Jewish oral Torah. Mm-hmm. Okay, it's oral scripture, oral tradition that's been written down, and one of its characteristic features, and I'm no expert, but it's just so obvious, open to seemingly any page, debate. Mm-hmm. It's one rabbi says this, another rabbi says that, and it's the preservation of debate about theological matters, and that is canonized essentially within the Jewish tradition. And I think, we as Christians, or those of the listeners who are Christians, can learn something from that debate is healthy.
Yeah, it's crucial. I learned the most in discussion with people, and I learned the most in discussion with people I disagree with. I want to get into some of the text critical stuff. You just mentioned the Talmud, which is I want to go back a step further. You and I have been having a conversation between people who are you much further into the field than I am, but I want to back up and kind of start from ground zero, because I know some have they don't even know what text criticism means. They don't know what a text critical scholar is. Now, we're not going to reinvent the wheel here, folks. If you want an introduction to text criticism, go to our Bible for the Rest of Us course. It's absolutely free over on the Disciple Dojo website. There is a whole series of opening sessions, and one of them is, what is text criticism? I think it's called Mistaken Manuscripts. I can't remember which session it is, but that's an introduction and a theological understanding of what the concept of text criticism is. But what we don't do in Bible for the Rest of Us is we don't actually get to talk to a text critic or someone who's done work in text criticism, who's done work in actually looking at Hebrew manuscripts and deciphering, is this word divided correctly, or is this Masoretic vowel pointing, should it be this instead of this? So that's what I wanted this time to the bulk of this time to be, is getting to pop the hood, as we say, and tinker around and see how it works. So what I want to ask on behalf of viewers and a little bit for myself is, how do you become a text critical scholar? And two, what does text critical scholarship consist of? Like, what do you actually do? Do you go around with a magnifying glass and libraries and monasteries and peer at old manuscripts? Are you like Indiana
There
Jones?
actually is an element of that for some of us. Yeah. Textual criticism. So let's define it in simple terms. So first of all, when we talk about criticism of the Bible, substitute the word criticism for analysis, because that's essentially what it is. When we talk about criticism of text, we're really talking about analysis. So text criticism is simply, or more broadly, an analysis of the text itself. So we have to ask, how did we even get that Bible translation? Well, obviously there were some scholars, and usually, the average Bible reader has no idea who these people are, have translated the Greek and Aramaic and Hebrew of the Old and New Testaments into English, or, whatever the target language is. And so there's this conception, or misconception, I should say, at least in evangelical circles, of what we mean by the original of the Bible. And people will use that term, the original. In the original, the Bible says this. And what is meant by that is in the original Hebrew of the Old Testament text, or in the original Greek, the text actually says this, right? Now, there's a fundamental problem with that term. What the idea that has been perpetuated in the church is that every book of the Bible originally there was one manuscript. So Paul dictated Romans, and there was one copy made at first, and then over time, many copies of that original version were made, and so on and so forth. By and large, with the New Testament, that's probably the case with most of the documents. At least with the Hebrew Scriptures, there is not one book, in my opinion, in the Hebrew Bible that was originally created as a document. Okay? So this idea of the original text of any book of the Old Testament, whether you're talking about Genesis or Jonah or Ezekiel, it doesn't matter. In terms of there being initially a finished product in the time of the author, I just don't know that that was the case. And what I mean to say by that, I should clarify that statement, that in Ezekiel's lifetime, the book of Ezekiel as we have it was not produced. Ezekiel did not produce the final form.
Right.
Okay? Certainly would have been involved either in writing or, at least in the oral transmission. In ancient Israel and in the ancient Near East, the oral aspect of textual transmission, and I'm going to use text in air quotes here, it plays a heavy, heavy role. We know when we look at Elijah, for instance, or Elisha, they didn't write a blessed thing. In fact, Jesus himself didn't write a thing.
Right.
And so even in New Testament times, orality is the norm, writing is not. And there's a good reason for that. Most people can't read. It's that simple. Mm-hmm. So one of the things I talk about in Jesus's Bible is, it's going to vary from culture to culture, but, in ancient Egypt, you're probably looking at like 3% literacy. Mm. I mean, think about that for a minute, 3% literacy. Ancient Mesopotamia, maybe, some estimates say 5%. Ancient Greece, maybe you can get as high as 10%, but that's very generous. And so we're talking about, let's say, an average of 5% literacy. And there's a good reason for it. It's because writing and reading does not help one to survive. Learning to read and write does not help you to have a successful harvest and feed your family. So we don't have this academic, literate culture that we have today. There certainly were people who could read and write and served a function principally in the temple and the court, the royal court. So it was going to be either a royal function or a religious function, a priestly function. But outside of that, most people could not read. In fact, the word for the most common word for read in biblical Hebrew, likro, to read, or some people learn it as kara, really means to proclaim, because reading was generally done by one person out loud for the benefit of many others. Mm-hmm. And so when the book of Revelation, this translates even into the New Testament, when the book of Revelation says, blessed are those who read the words of these books, that really needs to be translated as blessed are those who proclaim the words of this book, because most people can't read. And the idea is that you even see this in Revelation 2 and 3, that these letters are being disseminated to the churches. Well, how are the church people getting the information? It's not with their eyes, it's with their ears. Mm-hmm. So all that to say, the operating assumption should be that we start with an oral tradition of some sort, And it eventually, sometimes very quickly, but sometimes there's a longer gap, it eventually becomes a written tradition. Even for those who take some of the statements in the Bible about Mosaic authorship, that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. Well, okay, so let's say Moses lived sometime around, the 13th century. Well, regardless of what you think about Genesis, I mean, just go back to Abraham, who maybe lived 1800, 2000, we're talking about hundreds of years, and there's nothing in Genesis to suggest that Abraham or, Isaac or Jacob or any of the 12 wrote any of these stories down. Mm-hmm. And so the operating assumption, coming back to text criticism here, is that we have to start with the understanding that there is no recoverable original. In most cases, it simply doesn't exist. There is no original. When David presumably wrote some of the Psalms, they were probably sung orally, modified orally over time, which is how many songwriters work today even. When you look at the superscriptions, or the titles, let's call them, at the heading of many Psalms, of David, of Solomon, of Moses. My favorite one is He-Man.
Mine too. He's right behind me.
Yeah, right. I know. I thought that would be appropriate. So, but if you take the book of Psalms at face value, then we see that, first of all, we've got a composer of the Davidic Psalms who did a lot of this stuff on the fly out in the wilderness when he didn't have access to writing materials. Mm-hmm. And secondly, that there were generations of people writing Psalms, and over time they were brought together, right? The book of Proverbs, you look at chapter 1, and, I think chapter 8 mentions Solomon. Proverbs 25 says Hezekiah in the 8th century has people working on the book of Proverbs. And then the last few chapters of Proverbs, those aren't Solomonic. It says right in the superscription that they're attributed to others. And so the question of what is the original text of any Old Testament book is highly problematic. And so that begs the question, well, what do text critics of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures actually do? What is their goal? And the goal really cannot be to get back to the original reading of any book, because there is no way to scientifically or objectively determine that any particular words that we talk about were necessarily there in the original version. So what we're looking for instead are ancient text traditions, and some of them are going to have a greater historicity, a longer historical transmission. And if you want to use the term more original, that would be more appropriate. Mm-hmm. But the fact of the matter is, it's so complicated that the way Bible translations operate, and I'll just speak about English, but it's true for other languages, is that when English Bible translations are produced, it is principally from a medieval text tradition called the Masoretic Text. And the Masoretic Text, as David Marcus and James Sanders pointed out, I think it was in biblical archaeology or something like that, they said it's not even the best text of the Hebrew Bible. And so one of the things that we just have to come to terms with is that it's just over the course of centuries of copying, mistakes and changes have crept in. And that's just the reality.
So when it comes to Old Testament, and this is something that is pretty different than New Testament, because like you said, New Testament does itself claim, most of the New Testament does claim to be the product of at least a particular author of each letter, each epistle, even each gospel. And in the Old Testament, there is not that. The question that people have, and I think it's a fair question, is, okay, how do we keep from falling down the slippery slope of, okay, we can't have textual absolutism in the Old Testament.
Right.
But that then seems to mean that we can't have any certainty of anything that we're reading. And if that's the case, how is it even inspired? How could Paul say all scripture is inspired, God breathed? You know, he's talking about the Old Testament. How could Jesus say it is written, if somebody could say, well, Jesus, is it written? You know, because that starts to sound like, did God really say? These are all of the, I think, very legitimate questions that people have, especially
Absolutely.
when it comes to Old Testament text criticism. So how do
Right.
we navigate that?
Where to begin? So to pick up on your comment about the New Testament, yeah, I forget what the figure is that Metzger and others have given, but in terms of scholars' ability to reconstruct what is probably the original version of each or of the New Testament as a whole, what it looked like, what each book looked like in its inception. The figures, I forget if it's in 97%, 99%.
It's high 90s. Yeah.
It's high 90s. So with the Hebrew scriptures, it just ain't even close. So we're talking about a tale of two testaments, as it were. And so the first thing that, for at least for people who are coming from more of an evangelical Christian view, is that in terms of the textual reliability of the New Testament, it is highly reliable. And a lot of the discrepancies have to do with very small things. For those who are concerned with the fundamental doctrines of the Christian faith, the bigger concern from text criticism anyway pertains to the New Testament more than it does to the Old Testament. And no major Christian doctrine rests on a text critical issue. So hopefully that will allay people's fears a little bit. But your point is still a valid one, that when Paul says in 2 Timothy that all scripture is God-breathed, or often translated inspired, he's essentially talking about the Hebrew scriptures. Now, what we have to remember, however, is that Paul is writing in Greek and if we assume that Timothy is in Ephesus, it's going to be an audience that is going to be reading and thinking about the Old Testament in Greek, not in Hebrew. And so before we can even understand what Paul's saying and the implications of what Paul is saying in 2 Timothy 3:16, we have to understand that who his audience is, presumably Ephesus, but even if it's not, it's a Greek-speaking audience for sure, an audience that could only access the Old Testament scriptures in Greek. And he's saying that those scriptures are God-breathed. Now, we know for a fact as text critics that the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament, contains corruptions. It contains mistakes because all copies of scripture, all translation is going to have some mistakes inherently. It also is full of interpretation, because at the end of the day, all translation, even if someone were here rendering this interview literally into Spanish for a Spanish-speaking audience, they have to interpret things that we're saying. Because that's what translation is. Translation is inherently an act of interpretation.
Yes.
And so the very fact that it is a translation means it's an interpretation. And then we know that there are corruptions in it, errors in transmission, that sort of thing. Certain books of the Greek scriptures existed in different versions. The book of Daniel is a great example. And Paul is aware of all of this, that for all its flaws, the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament, is inspired by God. And so that's important because he understands that whatever the flaws of that translation are, God is acting in people's lives through versions of scripture, copies of scriptures that are corrupted. And that is no different from today, for instance. There are, one example that, I can come back to later, but there are a number of verses where the NIV, for instance, might omit a verse that might be found in the New American Standard Bible or the King James Version. Now, regardless of where a person stands on those issues, if we just stop and say, has God, to the best of our understanding, transformed people's lives through the reading of the King James Bible that has this verse? And the answer, I think we'd have to admit, is yes. And then, has God transformed people's lives through the reading of the NIV, which lacks that verse? And the answer is yes. Well, one of them's not right. Maybe both of them aren't right. Mm-hmm. But either way, we have corruptions and deficiencies, even in modern English translations, and yet we see people's lives being transformed in the church. All that to say, it doesn't need to, it shouldn't logically lead us to the conclusion that we can't trust anything the Bible says. Mm-hmm. Yes, there are other questions that come up, but it should not pull the rug out from under our faith in God.
Yeah, I think that's a point that's worth emphasizing to viewers too. Even what you're saying, sticking with the Hebrew scriptures, with the Old Testament, it's like there's a range of views on how certain we can be of what we're reading. And it's not like you have to either have absolute certainty or absolute uncertainty, but rather you can say, this is what we have. This is what the text is. And I think you have to look at different books rather than the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, because like you said, they weren't bound. They weren't even bound together until after the Christian era. So
that's absolutely right.
You had scrolls, the writings, the prophets, Torah. When you look at those individually, there has to be a level of ambiguity that you decide you're comfortable with. And for some scholars, it's higher than others. And some scholars take a more conservative approach and say, actually, no, I think we can be more certain than Chris is saying here. And other scholars would say, actually, no, I don't even think we can be as certain as he's saying.
Right.
So there's a spectrum. And I think that's important to know, because viewers will inherently want to, want to argue, want to fight over it. And I don't discourage that. And the comment sections are wide open for people to, and they do leave their views. But I just want to make sure people hear, especially those, casual viewers who aren't in the weeds of text criticism, that what Chris is talking about, text criticism, is reconstructing the text. Mm-hmm. And that's a different thing than telling the origin of the text. So if we reconstruct, let's say, the book of Jonah, if we reconstruct the text of Jonah, we can make it a goal of, okay, what is the Masoretic text of Jonah that the Masoretes in the around 1000 AD were working with? What is the Dead Sea Scroll? What were the Qumran community reading when they read the text of Jonah? And then what is the Septuagint text of Jonah? Those are separate questions. And then once you have as good an answer as you can get on those questions, then you have to do the work of, okay, now these are our different witnesses, these different traditions.
Right.
Which of them is the book of Jonah that we are going to present to readers in a translation? Yeah. And even all of that is a different question than, how did the book of Jonah get written in the first place? Did Jonah write it after these events? Is it a parable that later writers in Israel or prophets in Israel wrote and used Jonah as the character? Tell it. Is it something else? I want readers to appreciate the complexity
Right.
of what goes into biblical scholarship, because too often Christians especially take a very facile view and just like, oh, scholars always bristle when people say, well, scholars believe. As soon as somebody says that phrase, I usually go, time out.
Yep.
Which scholars? What is the specific issue? Like you just open. There's no consensus on some things,
Yep.
and so it's. I mean, we're pulling back the curtain, showing what goes on, how this whole process works, and it can get messy for some people.
Absolutely.
But for other people, it's exhilarating. You know, I had in seminary, one of my roommates, we roomed together for a semester at Gordon Conwell, Mike Doboshinsky. I don't know where he is today. Mike, if you're ever seeing this, this is who I'm talking about. He's not on Facebook, I don't think, so I don't know if but anyway, Mike, message me if you get this. It's been too long. He was a biblical languages major. I was MDiv. So our class loads, our workloads were very, very different. And we were talking about calling one time around dinner in the cafeteria. A bunch of people were like, what's your dream ministry? And everybody was going around saying what theirs were. One lady said, I want to be a chaplain on a cruise ship. And I was like, I didn't even know that's a thing, but man, that sounds amazing. Yeah. Well, Mike said, I want to get a job at a small Christian college and just do text criticism all day. And literally sift through manuscripts and examine letters and decide, is this a yod or a vav? Is this, I mean, that jokingly, I was like, oh, way to be salt and light, because I was picturing somebody tucked away. And then immediately I was like, actually, no, that's not true. I'm just kidding. I'm going to be reading your Bible someday. Like I'm going to be, if I'm teaching and preaching, I'm going to be using a translation that was based on a critical edition that you probably worked on. And so you are being salt and light. Text critic, people who, cloister away in monasteries and dusty manuscripts. We joke about it, but that is being salt and light if it leads to the production of a more reliable presentation of those God-breathed scriptures. And so that's something that I do look at Richard Middleton and I were talking about this. He said he's never separated his academia from ministry. He's always viewed academia as perfectly aligned with his ministry. And I want to express that to viewers too. I don't think there needs to be conflict. There will be tension, but I don't think there needs to be conflict on it. So then what do you work? Tell me what text critical work you have spent the most time doing professionally.
The first book that I published, which is a revision of my doctoral dissertation, is a book called The Subloco Notes in the Former Prophets of Biblica Hebraica Stuttgartensia.
All right. And every viewer's familiar.
Exactly. And this is, so this is the point in the conversation where everybody's eyes gloss over and, where do we go from here, right? So
viewers, behind me, right behind Captain America there on the shelf is the Biblica Hebraica Stuttgartensia, the BHS. So that's what that is. Now tell us what that is.
Right. So BHS, as we call it, it's the fourth edition of the Biblia Hebraica, which is what we'd call a critical edition of the Hebrew Bible. By critical edition, how to put it, it's an edition essentially for scholars and advanced students, which presents the text of the Bible, in this case, the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, along with essential information such as variant readings. You will see notes at the bottom of the page which mention the different readings that are found in these manuscripts. Those who use study Bibles will sometimes see a footnote in their study Bible that says some manuscripts say, and that's kind of how it works in a critical edition. It's just that the text that we look at is in the quote unquote original, and those other manuscripts and what they say is actually presented at the bottom of the page so that we can sift through the different possibilities. An example, I'll give you an example out of the New Testament that's really easy. So if you look at the Gospel of Mark, and JM will put it up on the screen here for us.
All right, so yeah, we've got Mark 1, and I've got the NIV here for viewers looking, and then the middle column, this is the NA 28, that's the Nestle Aland or Nestle Aland Greek 28th critical edition, and then the United Bible Societies, this is actually USB 5. I don't know if you said you're using 4 or not, but
nope, I got the 5th edition.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is our English, this is a typical English translation on the left, and then 2 different critical Greek editions. And so, Chris, what did you want us to look at here?
So what we get here is in the text as it's presented in the UBS 5, what it says, Arche tu Evangeliu Jesu Christu huiu theu, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So that's the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ is the translation, standard translation of the first 5 words that you see. So even if you don't know Greek, those first 5 words translate to the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And then in the UBS, you can see that the last 2 words are in square brackets. Those words, huiu theu, mean Son of God, the Son of God. Okay, and so the reason why they're in brackets is because there is different manuscript evidence as to whether those words should be considered an original component of the Gospel of Mark. Okay, and one of the things that we can look at on the screen is Codex Siniaticus. And we can see that this important manuscript, which dates to the 4th century, is ambiguous as to whether the verse should end with the word Christ or with Son of God. The original text of Codex Siniaticus has the word, it ends with Christu, of Christ, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, period. That's what the original the manuscript said originally. But there was a later a correction that added the words huiu theu, the Son of God. Okay, so now there is a question as to which one is the best reading, and scholars are divided. And for that reason, you will see it in some Bibles. A footnote is presented that says, some manuscripts lack the word Son of God. In the UBS text, they just put it in square brackets. That's their way of saying, we don't know if these words should really be here or not.
Right. NIV has a footnote. It just says, some manuscripts do not have, and then in italics, the Son of God. So what NIV editors are telling you as a reader is that this phrase, what Chris just said, huiu theu, is not in some manuscripts. And the critical edition, so here's UBS, at the bottom of the screen, you can see all of that gobbledygook that just popped up there for those of you. Even for me, some of it's gobbledygook. But that's the apparatus. That's text critical scholars saying, here are the manuscripts that say this. Here are the manuscripts that read this way. And it lists the name of the manuscripts even by their number or by their family, or but that's what that is. That stuff at the bottom of the page. Super important for translators, for scholars, even for educated preachers sometimes when it makes a difference.
Yep. And with this example, I think this is a great example to illustrate what a critical edition is, because just from the I think it was the NIV you said with that footnote.
Yep.
That's essentially what a critical edition is. It's just that it's in the original language, and instead of just saying, hey, some manuscripts lack this or some manuscripts say that, they actually give you the manuscript evidence so that you can sort through it and make a decision. But this is also valuable for another reason. And in this verse, we see the intersection of textual criticism, the study of the text itself, with theology. Because one of the things that many people who prefer the King James Bible, for instance, will say is that newer translations sometimes remove words from the Bible. And they'll say that that's problematic for theological reasons, because their argument will be something like this. Look, some of these translations remove the word Son of God from the text. Therefore, that translation is trying to
take away the divinity of Jesus.
Exactly, yes. And nothing could be further from the truth, because all you have to do is look at a version of the Bible where there are missing words and phrases and verses, and what you will find is that they still affirm the divinity of Christ, or Christ's miracle working power, whatever the issue you think is.
Yeah.
And so these are just some common misconceptions. And so I mention that because an awareness, even a basic awareness of what's involved in textual criticism, can be of value in ministry, in that we can at least help the people, the laity of our church, to understand that these differences between the English translations are not theologically problematic issues. It's really just a textual issue. But you could take the word Son of God, maybe they didn't really belong there, in Mark 1:1. You'll find a gazillion other verses in the New Testament that call Jesus the Son of God.
Yes, and viewers, if you want to know more about that in particular, I had a great discussion with Mark Ward over at Faith Life and Logos, and we talked about the King James only and the whole push behind some people, why they criticize modern translations. And Mark's a friend of the channel, and I encourage you to follow him as well. But that is what I've found, and Mark agreed with this, not all, but most people who are the most dogmatic about particular English translations are the least familiar with text criticism and how it actually works and how translation works. So beware, viewers, I think, should be aware of those confident voices that are dogmatically proclaiming this Bible version is doing this and this Bible version is doing that. And they just give little piecemeal examples, but they don't actually explain the process, the why.
Right.
So you mentioned, so tell me the title of your doctrinal work again. You said it earlier.
The Subloco Notes in the Former Prophets of Biblica Hebraica Stuttgartensia.
Yes. So I wanted to ask you, the Subloco Notes. Now that sounds Spanish.
Yes.
That sounds
Latin.
Less than crazy.
So close enough, though. Yeah.
Yep. What are the Subloco Notes? Now the Former Prophets also is a term that some people may not have heard before. So break down that we know what. So we've established what BHS is. Now, what are the Subloco Notes, and then what are the Former Prophets?
Yeah, so I get working backwards. So we've got BHS. It's the critical edition, the scholarly edition of the Hebrew Bible that gives us manuscript evidence to sort through. The Former Prophets are Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. In the Jewish tradition, the Joshua, Judges, and Samuel, and Kings are not looked at as historical books principally. They're looked at as prophetic books.
Interesting.
And so, so the Hebrew Bible, the manuscripts that we use are Jewish manuscripts. They're produced by Jews, not Christians. And unlike in Christianity, the Jewish tradition, the Hebrew Bible is divided into three components. And we use the acronym Tanakh. And so in English, we'll work with the letters T and K. T is for Torah, which means, many people might be familiar with the term the law of Moses. Mm-hmm. So Genesis through Deuteronomy, that is the Torah. Nevi'im, the N in Tanakh, means prophets. And then K is for Ketuvim, which means everything that's not Torah and prophets. So things like Ecclesiastes and Song of Songs and Chronicles actually go in there. But the prophets are divided up into two subcomponents. We have the latter prophets, which are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12, not 13, the 12 minor prophets. Daniel is not in the prophetic subcorpus there. So the latter prophets are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12 minor prophets. The former prophets are Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. Mm-hmm. And so in the Hebrew Bible and Hebrew manuscripts, after the book of Deuteronomy comes Joshua, then Judges, not Ruth, and Samuel and Kings. So, so that's the former prophets. So that book deals with just Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. Now, the subloco notes are a group of textual notes that are in BHS that one of the editors added. And he would add, whenever there was a problem, he'd add an index number and he would write subloco, which means there was supposed to be a discussion about these problematic notes that he was going to publish in a later edition. Well, he died before he published that edition.
What does subloco actually literally mean from Latin?
Yeah, so subloco, it's essentially referring to, it essentially means like, beneath. And so the way BHS was constructed, unlike the New Testament, the Hebrew Bible contains a system of quality control, which involves some interpretation, but it's a system of quality control called the Masorah. And the Masorah includes everything from the vowel points on Hebrew words, the vowel letters that were added in the Middle Ages. It includes a bunch of small marginal notes, and the notes on the side are called the Masorah Parva or Masorah Ketana, the small Masorah. And then there's the Masorah Magna or Masorah Gedolah, which is the big Masorah. And so every page in the Hebrew Bible in a medieval manuscript is going to have the text, the actual consonant letters of the Hebrew text. It's going to have pointings for vowel markers. It's going to have accent marks or cantillation marks. That's part of the Masorah. And then it's going to have those notes on the side, the Masorah Parva and the Masorah Gedolah, which are quality control notes, essentially, to ensure that the Hebrew Bible, the text as the scribes received it, would be transmitted accurately. Because it was done in a day and age, obviously, when there was no printing press. And so because of the complexity and the length of the Hebrew Bible, the scribes, whom we call Masoretes, needed to ensure that the text was copied accurately. Now, the quality control system ended up having corruptions of its own or complexities of its own. And so some of those majorly problematic notes were indicated, kind of like what we saw in Mark 1:1, with a reference number and the note subloco. And that means the reader was supposed to consult this other volume for a commentary, which never appeared. And so essentially, I wrote a commentary on, I think it was like 415 scribal notations that come from medieval manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible to discuss what those complexities really are. Needless to say, a very niche subfield of research.
It's not hitting the bestseller list?
No. In fact, I haven't made a dime off the publication. I think if you go on Amazon, the book goes for like $198. And so, no, the truth is, when we had an annual meeting at SBL, that dealt with these types of things, there were really, 25 people to 50 people on the planet who could really appreciate what was going on there.
Right.
But essentially I did it because it was, something that nobody had done before. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to do something new, but it also helped me, I think, to be able to fill in a void in scholarship. But the value in that sort of thing, where initially people don't see the value of it, is what it forced me to do is with a magnifying glass, get in there and work with manuscripts and understand what actually went into producing copies of the Hebrew Bible. And what became clear to me through the process is that there is no way that a manuscript could be copied without mistakes creeping in. And every manuscript that we have has corruptions. It has mistakes because, and being a little bit theological here, God allowed people to do this work, human beings, just like you and me. Mm-hmm. And so it gave me an appreciation, in a sense, for what the biblical text is and what we can know about it and what the biblical text is not. So is the Bible text letter perfect? No, absolutely not. There is no such thing as a letter perfect edition of the Bible that is extant or in existence today. And yet the text that we have, the medieval text that I worked on, is essentially the same text that was in Jesus's day becoming the leading, most popular text of the Hebrew Bible. And so were there discrepancies over the course of, the 1,000 years? Yes, there were discrepancies, but they were surprisingly small and relatively insignificant.
That's what every textual critic I've ever talked to has noted and has been very made that very clear.
Right.
The famous example of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Great Isaiah Scroll, and when you analyze and then look at, actual differences, not difference in spelling this word or difference in pronunciation or even a word out of order or something. But it came down to a handful of differences that really made a difference in such a massive text that's so ancient. And that, to me, has always been something that it shows God in the process, is God producing. His word does not depend on letter perfect carbon copies of a text, but rather, and that's this comes along when people have misconceptions about how we got our Bibles. They think it's like a long game of telephone, Bibles today are based on a copy of a copy of a copy, when in reality, Bibles today, English Bibles today, are based on laying out as many of the copies and manuscripts and variants as humanly possible, comparing them, figuring out, doing the work of, what is the most likely variant? How did this one arise? How did a manuscript have huiou theou in it and this manuscript not? What plausible reasons could there be? Did it get erased? Did it get misheard? Did it get miscopied? Did two letters get switched? Is it an abbreviation? Because words like Son of God would be abbreviated because writing was not cheap back then. So there's so many, and we touch on these in Bible for the Rest of Us. We give examples of Old Testament, things like metathesis and homeotelleuton and, all of the fun ones that people love to throw out at cocktail parties. But the reason that we do that is so that people can see that modern English Bibles take all of that into account. It's not like they're based on one manuscript, and if that manuscript has an error in it, well, that's what you're reading. It's be careful, Christians readers, non-Christian reader, anybody reading the Bible, but particularly Christian readers who care about this stuff, read the footnotes in your Bibles. There's a reason that they're there. Read the preface in any translation of the Bible you're doing. It will talk about whether the Old Testament of that translation is based on the Masoretic Text, or some will even say the base text is the Leningrad Codex, which is essentially the BHS, which now BHQ I think is the next version of that, and you can talk about that in a second. But none of this stuff is hidden. It's not Da Vinci Code, folks. Like, this stuff is not tucked away and the Catholic Church is keeping it under wraps, or the Orthodox Church or what. No, it's all out there in the open. Every critical edition you pick up, it will tell you all of this stuff right there on the page. It's just a question of, do you have the competency to read the notes or not? And that does take learning, but it's like any field of study. You have to have a basic competency the further you want to go into that field. And so you've gone really far pretty narrow in a focus, like that dissertation at least, very, very focused on a very, like you said, it's a very niche thing. And my roommate who I mentioned earlier, Mike, he used to say, yeah, I think Doug Stewart was his advisor. It might have been Niehaus or one of the other Old Testament guys at Gordon Conwell, but they said when he was talking about what he wanted to do and going on to PhD work, they said, listen, don't do this if you can't be content with the fact that 8 people in the world will end up reading your stuff, because that's what's going to happen. But that's in any field of study. And human knowledge is advanced corporately by millions of people going so deep and so narrow, and only a few others coming along. But then that trickles down. That has a cascade effect all the way down into somebody who can't even read the Bible, but they're listening to a Sunday school teacher read them a story out of their Revised Standard Version or whatever version of the Bible they're reading. And to me, that's the beauty of it. The body of Christ analogy is nowhere more crystal clear than in the world of biblical scholarship, because you need every member of the body. Even the boring ones are important because they are contributing to the discussion and to the advancement of knowledge. And not everything is for everybody. And not everything should be at a popular level. Some people even watching this are probably like, all right, you guys lost me 30 minutes ago, but that's okay though. That's all right. We're like I said, we're pulling back the hood.